Welcome to Philosophy Playground, where today we dive into a journey through history and philosophy, uncovering the revolutionary thoughts of Immanuel Kant, a towering figure of the Enlightenment. But why should you care about an 18th century philosopher in our fast-paced, modern world? Because Kant dared to ask questions that are still as relevant as ever. How do we know what's right and wrong? Should we trust authority or think for ourselves? And what does it really mean to be free? Let me take you back to a time when the world was on the brink of a great awakening, the Enlightenment. Picture an age when thinkers across Europe began questioning the authority of monarchs and religious institutions, demanding that reason and evidence become the guiding lights of human progress. While many pushed against tradition, few took this challenge as far and as rigorously as Immanuel Kant. Born in 1724 in the modest town of Königsberg, East Prussia, Kant would rise to redefine what it means to think freely and live morally. In this episode, we'll unravel the life and ideas of Kant, whose work sits at the crossroads of faith, reason, duty, and freedom. From his critique of religious dogma and political power to his profound ethical philosophy centered around the categorical imperative, we'll see why his influence endures. Along the way, we'll explore modern parallels, whether it's today's struggles for social justice, debates about artificial intelligence ethics, or global challenges like climate change. Buckle up, because by the end of this journey, you may find yourself questioning how you make choices and what guides your moral compass. Ready to explore Kant's world? Let's begin. The Enlightenment era, spanning the 17th and 18th centuries, was a period characterized by profound intellectual, scientific, and cultural transformation. This age emphasized reason, individualism, and skepticism toward traditional authorities, particularly religious and monarchical institutions. It was an era driven by the conviction that human reason and evidence could illuminate truths about the world, leading to advancements in science, politics, and human rights. Figures such as Voltaire, Rousseau, and John Locke championed critical thinking and the notion of individual liberty, pushing societies towards secular governance and a new respect for individual agency. Immanuel Kant, born in 1724 in the modest town of Königsberg, East Prussia, now Kaliningrad, Russia, emerged as a monumental figure in this period. Kant's upbringing was deeply rooted in a pietistic Lutheran family, where religious devotion shaped daily life with strict moral codes and a focus on humility and discipline. Despite the stringent religious environment, Kant's exposure to pietism instilled a strong ethical foundation, which would later become central to his philosophical inquiries. Kant's early education reflected the societal tensions of the time, a juxtaposition of religious orthodoxy and emerging Enlightenment ideals. He attended the University of Königsberg, Albertina University, where he initially studied theology, driven by his family's religious inclinations. However, his interests soon veered toward natural sciences, mathematics, and philosophy, influenced by the works of Sir Isaac Newton, René Descartes, and other pioneers of the scientific revolution. Kant became captivated by the systematic application of reason to understand the physical universe. This intellectual awakening marked a pivotal shift in his thought process, steering him away from the dogmatic confines of religious teachings and toward a broader, more analytical exploration of knowledge. During his university years, Kant studied under Martin Knudsen, a philosopher and mathematician who introduced him to the works of Newton and Leibniz. Knudsen's influence extended beyond scientific theories. He also introduced Kant to debates about metaphysics and epistemology, planting seeds that would blossom into Kant's critical examination of human cognition. This period of study laid the groundwork for Kant's eventual synthesis of empiricism, which asserts that knowledge is derived from sensory experience, and rationalism, which posits that knowledge can arise from reason alone. The intellectual rigor of these debates highlighted for Kant the limits of both perspectives when taken to extremes, prompting his quest to reconcile these viewpoints. Königsberg in the mid-18th century was a bustling intellectual hub. Kant interacted with scholars, merchants, and travelers who brought diverse ideas and perspectives to this isolated Prussian outpost. These interactions deepened his awareness of societal and philosophical change sweeping across Europe. Kant's reflections on this evolving world led him to critique existing power structures, including religious and political authorities. For Kant, blind adherence to dogma, whether religious or political, was antithetical to the Enlightenment ideal of using reason as a guide to understanding and self-determination. However, Kant's critique was not a wholesale rejection of religion. Unlike some radical Enlightenment figures who called for a complete dismantling of religious institutions, Kant recognized the social utility of religion. He appreciated its role in fostering ethical behavior and social cohesion. Yet, he worried that reliance on religious doctrine without the exercise of reason risked stunting humanity's intellectual and moral growth. This tension, between valuing religious tradition and advocating for critical independence, became a defining element of his philosophy. Consider a parallel with modern influential figures navigating complex traditions and reforms. Think of leaders like Nelson Mandela, who, despite confronting apartheid's entrenched injustices, recognized the need for gradual reconciliation and institutional stability. Similarly, Kant aimed to bridge tradition and modernity, offering a framework where rational thought could coexist with ethical principles derived from religious contexts, without compromising intellectual freedom. Kant's transition from theological studies to philosophy was not merely a rejection of religious tenets. It was an affirmation of humanity's capacity for reason. By the time he began teaching and writing extensively, he had developed a reputation as a meticulous and rigorous thinker. He remained in Königsberg throughout his life, declining offers from prestigious institutions across Europe. This provincial stability contrasted with the radical dynamism of his thought and writings, which influenced generations far beyond his native city. Kant's foundational belief in the importance of enlightenment is exemplified in his famous essay, "What is Enlightenment?" In it, he defines enlightenment as humanity's emergence from self-imposed immaturity, urging individuals to think for themselves rather than rely on the authority of others. Sapir Ode, Dare to Know, became a rallying cry of his philosophy, a call to cultivate one's reasoning capacity and autonomy. This ethos mirrored Enlightenment thinkers like Thomas Jefferson, who drafted the U.S. Declaration of Independence, emphasizing the rights of individuals to self-governance and freedom of thought. Kant's insistence on intellectual independence was both a personal credo and a broader critique of society's prevailing norms. To fully grasp Kant's development as a thinker, one must understand the interplay between his personal experiences, religious heritage, and exposure to Enlightenment ideals. His early religious instruction, while at odds with Enlightenment values, paradoxically equipped him with the moral seriousness and intellectual discipline that became hallmarks of his philosophy. Kant would go on to articulate a vision where reason was paramount, not as a tool for undermining morality, but as the very foundation upon which ethical behavior and meaningful self-determination rested. In summary, Kant's early life reflects a microcosm of the Enlightenment's broader struggles. He was a product of both religious orthodoxy and intellectual liberation, navigating between tradition and reason. This duality shaped his philosophical endeavors and inspired his quest to define the limits and capabilities of human understanding. His journey from a pious youth in Königsberg to one of history's most influential philosophers exemplifies the Enlightenment spirit, a relentless pursuit of knowledge grounded in reason, tempered by ethical considerations, and aware of the complex interplay between tradition and progress. Immanuel Kant's break with traditionalism reflects a critical turning point in both his life and the trajectory of Enlightenment thought. His growing skepticism of religious and political authorities was deeply influenced by the intellectual currents of his time. Kant's critical approach was not born out of sheer rebellion, but rather a reasoned belief that human freedom and moral autonomy required a departure from blind adherence to established norms and external authority. Kant's formative years in Königsberg were marked by exposure to rigid pietism, a Protestant movement that emphasized personal piety and strict moral behavior. Although this religious upbringing shaped Kant's ethical outlook, it also exposed him to the dangers of dogmatism and unquestioning obedience. Over time, Kant became deeply critical of religious doctrines that demanded blind faith and discouraged independent thought. His philosophical inquiries led him to view reason as the highest authority for guiding human life. To Kant, the Enlightenment was a call to courageously use one's own intellect without relying on the dictates of religious institutions or the decrees of political rulers. In his famous essay, What is Enlightenment?, Kant defined enlightenment as man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity, urging people to think independently and reject the comfort of imposed guidance. Kant's skepticism toward traditional authority was not merely theoretical. He lived in a time when the power of the church and state was intertwined, often stifling individual freedom and suppressing dissenting views. In 18th century Prussia, the state wielded substantial control over religious practices, and deviations from official doctrines could result in severe punishment. Kant, recognizing the dangers of such centralized control, argued that reason, not coercive authority, should be the basis for moral and political decision-making. He was particularly critical of rulers who demanded loyalty without question, viewing such demands as an affront to human dignity and autonomy. Kant's insistence on the use of reason to examine all forms of authority, religious or political, marked a radical departure from the prevailing norms of his era. Kant was not alone in his critique of traditional authority. He was part of a broader Enlightenment movement that sought to challenge the status quo. Figures like Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and David Hume also championed reason, skepticism, and the rights of the individual. Voltaire's scathing critiques of the Catholic Church's power and his advocacy for freedom of speech likely resonated with Kant, though Kant was less inflammatory in his approach. Rousseau's emphasis on individual freedom and social contracts may have also influenced Kant, even as he disagreed with Rousseau's more emotive, naturalistic views on human nature. The cross-pollination of ideas among these thinkers created a vibrant intellectual environment in which challenging tradition was not only encouraged but necessary for societal progress. Kant's relationship with David Hume's empiricism was particularly transformative. Hume's radical skepticism about human knowledge and causation shook the foundations of philosophy and deeply influenced Kant's thinking. Hume argued that human understanding was limited to empirical observations, and that reason alone could not prove fundamental concepts such as causality. For Kant, this was a wake-up call. He famously wrote that Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumber. In response, Kant sought to reconcile the limitations of empiricism with the rationalist belief in the power of reason. The result was his groundbreaking work, Critique of Pure Reason, which attempted to establish the limits and scope of human knowledge. By doing so, Kant provided a framework in which human cognition was both empowered and humbled. Reason could discern the conditions for knowledge, but it could not grasp things as they exist independently of human experience. In addition to his philosophical engagement with contemporaries, Kant's critique of traditionalism extended to political thought. The Prussian state, under Frederick the Great, was seen by many as an enlightened monarchy. Frederick's policies promoted religious tolerance and intellectual freedom to a certain extent, but the king's control over civil and religious life remained significant. Kant was critical of even the so-called enlightened despotism, as it ultimately placed too much power in the hands of a single ruler. He believed that true enlightenment required a commitment to individual freedom and autonomy, not just well-intentioned paternalism. Kant's political philosophy emphasized the idea of perpetual peace, arguing that political arrangements must be founded on principles of equality, justice, and the mutual respect of individuals and nations. To illustrate the broader relevance of Kant's critique, consider parallels with modern figures who challenged traditional authority. Mahatma Gandhi's resistance against British colonial rule in India and Martin Luther King Jr.'s fight for civil rights in the United States exemplify the kind of moral courage Kant admired. Both leaders, in their own ways, demanded that political and social systems be subjected to the scrutiny of reason and justice. Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent resistance, rooted in moral principles, aligns with Kant's insistence on acting according to universal ethical laws. Similarly, King's appeal to the moral law resonated with Kantian ethics, emphasizing that unjust laws must be challenged through peaceful civil disobedience. Kant's break with traditionalism was not about destroying the institutions of religion and government, but reforming them to align with the demands of reason, freedom, and moral duty. He envisioned a society where individuals could think and act independently, guided by rational principles rather than the dictates of dogma or arbitrary power. This vision remains a cornerstone of modern liberal thought and underscores the enduring influence of Kant's philosophy. By challenging traditional authorities, Kant laid the groundwork for a more enlightened, self-governing society, one that continues to grapple with the balance between individual freedom and collective responsibility. Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason stands as one of the most significant works in Western philosophy, seeking to reconcile the opposing schools of empiricism and rationalism while reshaping the framework of how humans acquire knowledge. Before Kant, empiricists such as John Locke and David Hume argued that knowledge derives solely from sensory experience. In contrast, rationalists like René Descartes and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz maintained that reason alone, independent of experience, can lead to true knowledge. Kant's intent was to bridge this divide and propose a new way of understanding human cognition that respected the contributions of both sensory input and reason, but demonstrated their limitations and interdependence. Synthesis of empiricism and rationalism. Kant's central claim in the Critique of Pure Reason was that human understanding arises from a synthesis of sensory experience, empirical data, and innate structures of the mind, rational frameworks. He famously stated, "Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind." This meant that our sensory perceptions provide the content of knowledge, but it is our mind's innate categories and structures that organize and interpret this content into meaningful concepts. For Kant, both elements were necessary for human cognition to function effectively. To illustrate this synthesis, consider an analogy of the mind as a lens through which we perceive reality. Just as a camera lens shapes and focuses light to produce an image, our mind shapes and organizes sensory data to create coherent experiences. The raw data alone, like photons hitting a camera sensor, would be meaningless without the structures that give it form and coherence. Kant argued that the mind has built-in categories, such as space, time, causality, and substance, that act as this lens, organizing sensory data into a comprehensible framework. A priori knowledge, space, and time. Central to Kant's philosophy is the distinction between a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge. A priori knowledge is independent of experience and derives from the mind's intrinsic structures. For example, mathematical truths such as 2 plus 2 is equal to 4 are known a priori because their validity doesn't depend on empirical observation. In contrast, a posteriori knowledge depends on sensory experience, like observing that the sky is blue. Kant further argued that space and time are not empirical concepts derived from experience, but a priori intuitions that structure all of our perceptions. Every experience we have is situated within space and unfolds over time because our minds are predisposed to interpret reality through these dimensions. Without these innate structures, Kant suggested, experience itself would be chaotic and incomprehensible. A practical way to understand this is to consider virtual reality, VR, experiences. When you put on a VR headset, the virtual environment you perceive is structured within the dimensions of space and time, even though it is a digital simulation. This illustrates Kant's claim that our perception of reality is shaped by the structures of our mind, not just by external stimuli. Empirical versus rational debate. The debate between empiricism and rationalism continues to manifest in various fields today, particularly in the tension between scientific research methods and philosophical reasoning. Empiricism underlies the scientific method, which emphasizes observation, experimentation, and data collection as the primary means of acquiring knowledge. Scientists conduct experiments, gather data, and refine hypotheses based on empirical evidence. For instance, medical research often relies on controlled clinical trials to determine the efficacy of new treatments. The accumulation of data through repeated observations is what lends credibility to empirical findings. On the other hand, Rationalism emphasizes the role of reason, logic, and theoretical constructs. Philosophical reasoning often delves into questions that empirical methods alone cannot answer. Consider ethical dilemmas such as the trolley problem, where you must decide whether to pull a lever to redirect a train and save 5 lives at the expense of one. This problem cannot be solved through data collection or sensory experience. It demands reasoned moral judgments and principles. A compelling modern example of the interplay between empiricism and rationalism can be seen in debates about artificial intelligence, AI, and machine ethics. Empirical approaches involve developing and testing algorithms based on data-driven models. But determining what constitutes ethical AI behavior often requires abstract philosophical reasoning. Should an AI prioritize minimizing harm, upholding human rights, or maximizing societal benefits? Kantian ethics, grounded in rational moral laws like the categorical imperative, would argue that ethical AI must operate according to universalizable principles rather than flexible, situation-dependent rules. Kant's categories of understanding. Kant proposed that the mind has innate categories of understanding that organize and interpret sensory data. These categories include concepts such as causality, necessity, unity, and plurality. For example, when we observe a ball rolling across a table, we instinctively understand that there must be a cause, e.g., a push for the motion. This understanding is not derived solely from experience. Rather, our mind applies the category of causality to make sense of the observation. Kant's categories can be compared to software filters on a smartphone's camera. When taking a photo, the filters automatically enhance colors, add effects, or adjust lighting based on pre-programmed algorithms. Similarly, our minds apply filters, categories of understanding, to sensory data, shaping how we perceive and interpret the world. This process is not merely passive reception of data. It is an active synthesis that creates coherent experience from disparate sensory inputs. The limitations of human knowledge. Kant's synthesis of empiricism and rationalism highlighted the limitations of human knowledge. He argued that we can never truly know things in themselves, noumena, the reality that exists independently of our perceptions. We can only know phenomena, or the appearances of things as shaped by our mental categories. This distinction had profound implications for metaphysics and epistemology. It suggested that metaphysical speculation about the ultimate nature of reality is inherently limited, as our knowledge is always filtered through the lens of human cognition. This insight continues to influence philosophical debates about the limits of human understanding. Consider quantum mechanics, a field that challenges our intuitive concepts of causality and determinism. Physicists observe phenomena that defy classical explanations, such as particles existing in multiple states simultaneously. While empirical data drives these discoveries, the interpretation often requires abstract, counterintuitive reasoning that stretches the boundaries of human comprehension. Kant's philosophy reminds us that our understanding of reality may always be constrained by the structures of our mind, even as we push the frontiers of scientific knowledge. Practical implications and modern relevance. Kant's synthesis of empiricism and rationalism offers a valuable framework for addressing contemporary issues. In politics, for example, debates often arise between empirical evidence and ideological principles. Policymakers must balance data-driven approaches, e.g., economic statistics, crime rates, with normative considerations about justice, equality, and human rights. Kantian philosophy, with its emphasis on reasoned principles and the limitations of empirical knowledge, provides a way to navigate these complexities. A relevant example is the climate change debate. Empirical data clearly demonstrates the impact of human activities on global warming, but crafting effective policies requires more than just data. It demands ethical reasoning about intergenerational justice, global responsibility, and economic equity. Kant's framework suggests that while empirical evidence is essential, it must be guided by rational principles that respect human dignity and the moral obligations we owe to future generations. In conclusion, Kant's critique of pure reason reshaped the philosophical landscape by synthesizing empiricism and rationalism and establishing a new way of understanding human cognition. His insights into a priori knowledge, space, time, and the limitations of human understanding continue to influence fields ranging from science to ethics and politics. By recognizing the interplay between sensory experience and reason, Kant provided a foundation for navigating complex dilemmas that require both empirical evidence and rational deliberation. His philosophy remains a vital guide for understanding the complexities of human knowledge and moral action in an ever-changing world. Immanuel Kant's ethical framework, centered around the concept of the categorical imperative, stands as one of the most influential systems in moral philosophy. At its core, Kantian ethics emphasizes duty, moral law, and the application of reason as the foundation for ethical action. Unlike consequentialist theories such as utilitarianism, which judge the morality of actions based on their outcomes, Kantian ethics focuses on the inherent moral worth of an action and the intention behind it. For Kant, moral principles are not contingent on personal desires or external consequences, but are instead grounded in universal, rational principles. Introduction to Kant's ethical framework. The categorical imperative is Kant's formulation for determining moral action. He proposed that ethical actions must conform to a universal law that any rational being could will to be a guiding principle for everyone. This contrasts with what Kant calls hypothetical imperatives, which are conditional and depend on achieving specific outcomes, e.g., if you want to be healthy, exercise regularly. The categorical imperative, on the other hand, is absolute and unconditional. It applies to all rational beings at all times, regardless of personal goals or circumstances. Kant offered several formulations of the categorical imperative, but the most well-known states, "Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law." In simpler terms, before acting, one must ask, what if everyone did this? If the action leads to a contradiction or an undesirable world, it is morally impermissible. This emphasis on universalizability ensures that moral principles are impartial and consistent. Real-life scenarios illustrating the categorical imperative. To understand Kant's principle in action, consider the act of lying. Suppose a person is tempted to lie to avoid embarrassment. According to the categorical imperative, they must ask whether they can will that lying become a universal law, that everyone lies whenever it suits them. If everyone lied, trust would collapse, and communication would become impossible. Thus, lying cannot be morally justified, as it would lead to a contradiction in the fabric of society. This contrasts sharply with utilitarian ethics, which might justify lying if it leads to a greater overall benefit. Consider a powerful contemporary example: whistleblowing. Suppose an employee discovers illegal activities within their company and faces a moral dilemma about whether to expose the wrongdoing. From a utilitarian perspective, the decision might hinge on the consequences, balancing harm to the company's reputation against potential justice for those harmed. For Kant, however, the focus would be on the duty to truth and justice. If the maxim "expose wrongdoing" can be consistently universalized without contradiction, the act becomes a moral duty, regardless of the consequences. The categorical imperative versus the golden rule. Kant's categorical imperative bears some resemblance to the golden rule, which states, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." Both emphasize moral reciprocity and treating others ethically. However, there is a critical distinction. The golden rule is based on subjective preference, what one wants others to do to them, while the categorical imperative is grounded in objective, rational principles that apply universally. Kant's approach is secular and focuses on moral universality through reason alone, avoiding the variability of personal desires and cultural norms. To illustrate this difference, consider a scenario involving religious tolerance. A person might wish to be treated kindly and respectfully regardless of their beliefs, which aligns with the golden rule. However, Kant would argue that respect for religious freedom must be upheld because it is a rational principle that can be consistently universalized. Even if a person did not care about religious tolerance for themselves, they would still be bound by a rational duty to respect others' beliefs under the categorical imperative. Critical analysis of the categorical imperative. While Kant's ethical system is admired for its consistency and emphasis on moral duty, it has also been subject to significant critique. One common criticism is the potential rigidity of Kantian ethics. Because the categorical imperative focuses on universal laws and adherence to duty, it can lead to morally inflexible conclusions in complex situations. Consider a classic thought experiment. Suppose you are hiding a friend from a murderer, and the murderer asks if you are sheltering anyone. According to the categorical imperative, lying is inherently wrong and cannot be universalized. Thus, Kantian ethics would require you to tell the truth, even though it leads to potentially disastrous consequences, a rigid stance that many find morally troubling. Critics argue that Kant's rigid adherence to rules overlooks the nuanced realities of human life and moral complexity. In response, Kantian scholars might emphasize that the categorical imperative does not demand blind adherence, but careful deliberation about the maxims one chooses to act upon. They may also point out that some maxims can be nuanced to account for context, e.g., do not lie unless it prevents great harm, though this risks diluting the clarity and universality of Kant's moral laws. Another critique concerns the assumption that all rational beings will arrive at the same moral conclusions through the categorical imperative. This assumption ignores the influence of cultural, psychological, and experiential differences on human reasoning. While Kant sought to establish a universal foundation for ethics, critics contend that moral reasoning is often influenced by subjective factors, making true universality challenging to achieve. Modern implications of the categorical imperative. Kant's ethical framework continues to influence contemporary debates in fields such as artificial intelligence, AI, bioethics, and global politics. Consider the ethics of AI decision-making. As AI systems become more autonomous, there is an urgent need to ensure that they act according to ethical principles. From a Kantian perspective, an AI system must follow maxims that can be consistently universalized without contradiction. For example, an autonomous vehicle's decision-making process in an emergency situation, e.g., choosing whom to prioritize in a collision, should be guided by principles that respect human dignity and treat all lives as equally valuable. This contrasts with utilitarian approaches that might prioritize maximizing overall survival, potentially leading to morally questionable outcomes. In global politics, the categorical imperative provides a framework for evaluating international actions and policies. Consider global climate change agreements. Under Kantian ethics, nations have a moral duty to adopt environmental practices that can be universalized, respecting the dignity and well-being of all people, including future generations. This stands in contrast to purely pragmatic or self-interested approaches, which may prioritize national gains over collective responsibility, personal interpretation, and reflection. Kant's emphasis on duty and universal moral laws provides a powerful counterweight to the relativism and situational ethics that often dominate modern discourse. His insistence that individuals act out of respect for moral law, rather than personal gain or emotional inclination, resonates with timeless ideals of integrity and moral consistency. In an era where ethical shortcuts and compromises are common, Kant's philosophy reminds us that morality must be grounded in principles that transcend individual circumstances. However, I believe that Kant's framework can benefit from a degree of flexibility without sacrificing its core commitment to rational moral law. While the categorical imperative provides a robust foundation for evaluating moral actions, real-world ethical dilemmas often require balancing competing duties and principles. This tension can be navigated by combining Kantian ethics with a pragmatic understanding of context, ensuring that moral duties remain relevant and applicable without becoming dogmatic. In conclusion, Kant's ethical framework, centered on the categorical imperative, offers a profound vision of moral duty grounded in reason and universalizability. By treating all rational beings as ends in themselves and adhering to principles that can be consistently applied, Kantian ethics challenges us to act with integrity and moral courage. While it may be criticized for its rigidity, Its commitment to rational moral laws provides a compelling counterbalance to the often inconsistent and self-serving ethical norms of contemporary society. Whether applied to the ethics of AI, international relations, or personal conduct, Kant's philosophy continues to guide and challenge us to live according to principles that uphold the dignity and worth of all human beings. Immanuel Kant's philosophy, particularly his moral principles and emphasis on reason, has inspired numerous historical and modern figures, shaping how societies and individuals grapple with ethical and moral challenges. His influence spans across generations, weaving through philosophical, political, and social transformations. By exploring historical figures influenced by Kant and examining contemporary scenarios that challenge Kant's moral framework, we can appreciate the enduring relevance and complexity of his theories. Historical figures influenced by Kant: Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Among those deeply influenced by Kant, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel stands out as one of the most notable. Although Hegel later diverged from Kant's strict emphasis on the individual's use of reason, he built upon and challenged Kant's framework. Kant's idea that reality is shaped by the human mind's categories served as a springboard for Hegel's dialectical approach to philosophy, wherein contradictions and opposing forces drive historical and social progress. While Kant saw the individual's reason as the pinnacle of moral action, Hegel extended this to a collective, emphasizing the development of ethical life within the state and society. Friedrich Nietzsche, a radical critic of Kantian ethics, represents another major figure profoundly influenced by Kant. Nietzsche grappled with Kant's moral rigidity and commitment to universal laws, ultimately rejecting the notion of objective moral principles. However, Nietzsche's engagement with Kant underscored the depth and complexity of Kant's ethical philosophy. In his critique of slave morality and emphasis on individual will to power, Nietzsche explored the limits and consequences of Kantian duty-driven morality, questioning its relevance in a world driven by human instincts, desires, and power dynamics. Influential statesmen and leaders, Kant's ethical philosophy also impacted political leaders such as Woodrow Wilson, whose vision for a League of Nations reflected Kant's call for perpetual peace and global cooperation. Kant's essay, Perpetual Peace, a philosophical sketch, outlined a vision of a world where nations abide by a common rule of law, foreshadowing modern international organizations like the United Nations. Wilson's belief in international diplomacy, self-determination, and collective security echoes Kant's idealistic commitment to moral principles on a global scale, even as it faced real-world challenges and complexities. Modern scenarios testing Kant's moral principles. Whistleblower cases. Edward Snowden. The case of Edward Snowden, who exposed widespread government surveillance, provides a compelling modern test of Kant's moral philosophy. From a Kantian perspective, whistleblowing raises questions about duty, truth-telling, and loyalty. Snowden justified his actions by appealing to the higher moral duty of exposing wrongdoing and protecting citizens' rights to privacy. The categorical imperative would require us to evaluate the maxim underlying his actions. If everyone exposed classified information whenever they believed it was morally justified, would that undermine national security and trust? Kantian ethics might suggest that Snowden's duty to truth and transparency outweighed loyalty to the government, as long as his actions adhered to principles that could be universalized without contradiction. However, critics argue that Kant's framework can be inflexible in complex situations like this. Would a world where every sensitive matter is publicly exposed lead to chaos? Kant's insistence on moral consistency forces difficult reflections on where the line between duty to truth and duty to security should be drawn, revealing the challenges of applying absolute principles to nuanced, real-world dilemmas. Ethical dilemmas faced by leaders. Angela Merkel's refugee policy. Former German Chancellor Angela Merkel's decision to open Germany's borders to refugees during the 2015 migrant crisis demonstrates the tension between Kantian moral duties and practical considerations. Merkel invoked humanitarian duty and the universal moral obligation to help those in need, aligning with Kantian ethics that emphasize treating all human beings as ends in themselves. by prioritizing moral duty over potential political backlash and social strain. Merkel exemplified Kant's commitment to ethical principles. Yet, this decision also highlighted the challenges of Kantian ethics in global politics. Critics argued that such policies strained social systems, raised security concerns, and fueled nationalist backlash. Kant's categorical imperative would demand consistent humanitarian treatment for all refugees, regardless of the potential consequences, illustrating the tension between ethical universality and the practical realities of governance. Personal interpretation and reflections on Kant's theories. Kant's emphasis on universal moral principles and duty-based ethics provides a powerful framework for addressing moral and ethical dilemmas. His insistence on treating individuals as ends in themselves resonates deeply in discussions about human rights, equality, and justice. Yet, the application of Kant's theories to complex, real-world scenarios often reveals their limitations and potential rigidity. Autonomy and personal responsibility. Kant's commitment to individual autonomy and moral duty underscores the importance of personal responsibility. His philosophy reminds us that true moral action arises from adherence to principles derived from reason, not from external pressures or personal inclinations. This idea finds resonance in contemporary debates about personal accountability in leadership and public service. Leaders who act with integrity, guided by duty to ethical principles, embody Kant's vision of moral autonomy. Consider, for example, the actions of whistleblowers, activists, and human rights advocates, figures like Malala Yousafzai, who risked her life to advocate for girls' education, exemplify Kantian duty-driven morality. Malala's unwavering commitment to the principle of education for all, despite facing violence and opposition, aligns with Kant's emphasis on acting according to universalizable principles, regardless of personal cost, collective morality, and societal norms. Kant's philosophy also challenges us to consider the role of collective morality and societal norms. While Kant emphasized individual moral duty, he recognized the importance of a moral community governed by shared principles. In today's interconnected world, global challenges such as climate change, human rights violations, and economic inequality demand collective moral action. Applying Kant's categorical imperative to these issues requires individuals and nations to adopt principles that can be consistently universalized, such as reducing carbon emissions or protecting vulnerable populations. However, Kantian ethics may struggle with the practical complexities of collective action. For example, efforts to address climate change often involve compromises and trade-offs that may not align perfectly with universal moral laws. Should nations prioritize their economic interests or adhere strictly to global environmental agreements? Kant's philosophy provides a moral compass, but does not always offer clear answers to such complex dilemmas. Analogies and modern connections. To illustrate the challenges and relevance of Kant's theories, consider the ethical implications of artificial intelligence, AI, development. AI systems increasingly make decisions that impact human lives, raising questions about fairness, accountability, and moral responsibility. Kantian ethics would require AI systems to act according to principles that respect human dignity and can be consistently applied to all individuals. This contrasts with purely utilitarian approaches that prioritize efficiency or overall outcomes, potentially at the expense of individual rights. For example, facial recognition technology has been criticized for its potential bias and misuse. A Kantian approach would demand that such technology be developed and deployed in ways that respect individual autonomy and avoid discriminatory practices. The categorical imperative would prohibit the use of AI systems that undermine human dignity or treat individuals as mere means to an end. This ethical stance challenges developers, policymakers, and society as a whole to prioritize moral principles over expediency or profit. Collective morality and modern leadership. Kant's moral philosophy also provides valuable insights into modern leadership and governance. Leaders who prioritize ethical principles, even in the face of political pressure or personal sacrifice, embody Kant's vision of moral duty. Consider Nelson Mandela's leadership during South Africa's transition from apartheid. Mandela's commitment to reconciliation and justice, even toward those who oppressed him, reflects Kantian principles of treating every human being as an end in themselves and adhering to universal moral laws. By choosing to lead with compassion and moral consistency, Mandela demonstrated the transformative power of Kantian ethics in shaping a more just and humane society. However, Kant's insistence on universal moral principles can be difficult to reconcile with the realities of political compromise and pragmatic decision-making. Leaders often face situations where competing moral duties and practical considerations collide. For instance, during the COVID-19 pandemic, government leaders had to balance public health measures with individual freedoms and economic stability. Kantian ethics demands adherence to principles that respect human dignity and prioritize the protection of life. But it may not provide clear guidance on navigating the complexities of public policy in a crisis. In conclusion, Kant's moral philosophy, centered on the categorical imperative and the duty to act according to universalizable principles, continues to challenge and inspire individuals and societies. By examining historical figures, modern leaders, and contemporary dilemmas, we can appreciate both the strengths and limitations of Kantian ethics. While Kant's emphasis on moral consistency and individual autonomy provides a powerful framework for ethical action, applying his theories to complex real-world scenarios often requires careful deliberation and adaptation. Kant's legacy endures as a reminder that true moral action demands courage, integrity, and a commitment to principles that respect the dignity and worth of every human being. Immanuel Kant's legacy in philosophy, politics, and the social sciences is vast and enduring. His influence permeates various disciplines, shaping how societies understand moral duty, human autonomy, and rationality. Kant's commitment to reason and universal moral principles remains a foundation for ethical decision-making and public policy. His ideas continue to provoke debate, inform governance structures, and inspire movements centered on human rights and justice. Kant's influence on modern philosophy. Kant's work redefined the boundaries of philosophy by offering a rigorous framework for understanding knowledge, morality, and human cognition. Before Kant, philosophical thought was polarized between empiricism, which emphasized sensory experience as the sole source of knowledge, and rationalism, which posited that reason alone could lead to truth. Kant's synthesis, as presented in his Critique of Pure Reason, argued that human knowledge arises from the interplay between sensory data and innate structures of the mind. This Copernican revolution in philosophy established a middle ground that has influenced subsequent philosophical developments. Kant's emphasis on reason and moral duty also laid the groundwork for deontological ethics, which focuses on adherence to moral laws rather than the consequences of actions. His categorical imperative, which demands that one act only according to maxims that can be consistently universalized, remains a touchstone for ethical theory. Kant's influence is evident in the works of later philosophers such as Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who expanded on Kant's ideas about reason and history, and John Rawls, whose theory of justice as fairness draws heavily on Kantian principles of equality and respect for individuals as ends in themselves. Kantian ethics in contemporary debates. Utilitarianism versus Kantian ethics in governance. Kant's deontological ethics often stands in contrast to utilitarianism, a consequentialist ethical theory that evaluates actions based on their outcomes. This tension is evident in contemporary debates about governance, where leaders must balance ethical principles with pragmatic considerations. For example, utilitarianism might justify policies that maximize overall welfare, even if they involve ethically questionable actions. Kantian ethics, on the other hand, emphasizes adherence to moral principles regardless of the consequences. Consider the debate over drone strikes in military conflicts. Utilitarian approaches may argue that drone strikes are justified if they minimize casualties overall, even if they involve collateral damage. A Kantian approach, however, would focus on the morality of targeting individuals without due process and the potential violation of human dignity. Kantian ethics demands that every human being be treated as an end in themselves, not as a means to an end. posing a moral challenge to policies that prioritize efficiency over ethical principles. This tension is also evident in debates over healthcare policy. A utilitarian perspective might advocate for cost-benefit analyses that prioritize treatments based on overall outcomes, potentially marginalizing those with rare or costly conditions. Kantian ethics, by contrast, insists on the equal moral worth of every individual, suggesting that healthcare policies must respect the dignity and needs of each person, regardless of cost or efficiency. Human rights and justice. Kant's emphasis on moral duty and universal human rights has profoundly influenced the development of modern human rights frameworks. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, reflects Kantian principles of dignity, equality, and the intrinsic worth of every human being. Kant's idea that all rational beings deserve respect and moral consideration underpins contemporary movements for social justice and equality. Consider the struggle for racial and gender equality. Kantian ethics demands that individuals be treated not according to arbitrary characteristics like race, gender, or nationality, but as rational agents deserving of respect and autonomy. This principle has inspired leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., who invoked universal moral laws in his fight for civil rights, emphasizing that racial discrimination is a violation of fundamental ethical principles. Similarly, Kant's emphasis on duty and moral obligation informs contemporary debates about immigration and refugee policies. Governments face moral dilemmas about balancing national security and humanitarian duty. Kantian ethics insists that refugees and immigrants be treated with dignity and respect, as every human being is entitled to moral consideration. This moral obligation often stands in tension with nationalistic policies that prioritize self-interest over universal moral duties. Reason and collective identity. Kant's philosophy emphasizes the role of reason in shaping personal and collective identities. For Kant, reason is not merely a tool for individual decision-making but a foundation for ethical community life. His concept of the kingdom of ends envisions a moral community where individuals act according to principles that respect the autonomy and dignity of others, creating a society governed by mutual respect and moral law. In modern democracies, Kant's emphasis on reason and autonomy underpins the values of freedom, equality, and participatory governance. The idea that citizens must use their reason to make informed decisions and hold their leaders accountable is central to democratic systems. Kant's philosophy encourages active engagement and moral responsibility, challenging individuals to think critically about laws, policies, and social norms. Freedom of expression and public discourse. Kant's commitment to reason also informs contemporary debates about freedom of expression and public discourse. In his essay, What is Enlightenment?, Kant argued that the public use of reason is essential for social progress and moral development. This idea supports the notion that free speech and open debate are necessary for a flourishing society. However, Kantian ethics also demands that freedom of expression be exercised with respect for others' dignity. Hate speech and incitement to violence, which undermine the dignity and autonomy of individuals, would be inconsistent with Kant's moral framework. Ethical leadership and moral integrity. Kant's philosophy places a high premium on ethical leadership and moral integrity. Leaders who act out of duty, guided by moral principles rather than self-interest or expediency, embody Kantian ideals. Consider Nelson Mandela's leadership during South Africa's transition from apartheid. Mandela's commitment to reconciliation, justice, and the moral dignity of every South African, regardless of race, reflects Kantian principles of treating individuals as ends in themselves. In contrast, leaders who prioritize power, personal gain, or the manipulation of public opinion violate Kant's ethical framework. Kant's insistence on acting according to universal moral laws serves as a moral check on leaders and institutions, demanding accountability and ethical consistency. Reason and autonomy in personal life. Kant's emphasis on reason and autonomy extends beyond politics and governance to personal life and individual identity. His philosophy challenges individuals to act according to rational principles, making moral choices that respect their own dignity and that of others. This idea is particularly relevant in today's consumer-driven society, where individuals are often treated as means to economic ends. For example, Kantian ethics would critique practices that exploit workers, commodify human relationships, or prioritize profit over human well-being. The principle of treating individuals as ends in themselves demands that economic and social systems respect human dignity and provide opportunities for individuals to flourish. This moral vision resonates with movements for labor rights, corporate social responsibility, and ethical consumerism, technological ethics, and AI. Kant's philosophy also provides a framework for addressing ethical challenges posed by technological advancements, such as artificial intelligence, AI, and data privacy. As AI systems become increasingly autonomous, ethical questions arise about accountability, fairness, and the impact on human autonomy. Kantian ethics demands that AI systems be designed and implemented in ways that respect human dignity, avoid discrimination, and promote fairness. This contrasts with purely utilitarian approaches that prioritize efficiency or profitability at the expense of ethical principles. Consider facial recognition technology, which has been criticized for its potential bias and misuse. A Kantian approach would insist that such technology be used only in ways that respect individual autonomy and avoid treating people as mere data points. This ethical stance challenges developers, policymakers, and society to prioritize human dignity over convenience or profit. Conclusion: the enduring relevance of Kant's legacy. Immanuel Kant's philosophy remains a powerful force in shaping modern thought, challenging individuals and societies to act according to reason and universal moral principles. His emphasis on moral duty, human dignity, and the role of reason continues to inspire movements for justice, ethical leadership, and human rights. While Kant's theories may be criticized for their rigidity or idealism, their enduring relevance lies in their capacity to guide moral action in a complex and often contradictory world. By engaging with Kant's legacy, we are reminded that true moral progress requires courage, integrity, and a commitment to principles that respect the dignity and worth of every human being. Immanuel Kant's philosophy centers on the power of human reason, the importance of moral duty, and the pursuit of ethical principles that apply universally. At its core, Kantian ethics challenges us to act not based on impulse, convenience, or even perceived outcomes, but from a deep-seated commitment to moral laws that respect the dignity and autonomy of every person. This emphasis on duty and universality continues to shape modern debates about ethics, governance, and individual conduct, encouraging us to rise above narrow self-interest and act in ways that uphold justice and human dignity. Key takeaways from Kant's philosophy. Kant's insistence that reason guides moral action is both empowering and demanding. He posits that all rational beings have the capacity to discern and act according to moral laws through reason alone. This means that ethical behavior is not merely a matter of social norms, personal preferences, or cultural traditions. It is rooted in principles that are universally valid and accessible to all. The categorical imperative, a central tenet of his philosophy, requires us to evaluate our actions by asking whether the maxims we follow could become universal laws. This approach demands consistency, integrity, and respect for the intrinsic worth of every individual. One of the key lessons from Kant's philosophy is the idea that true moral action must come from duty, not from external pressures or self-serving motivations. To act morally, according to Kant, is to act from respect for moral law, even when it is inconvenient or costly. This emphasis on duty has profound implications for personal and collective behavior. It challenges us to reflect on the principles that guide our choices and to prioritize ethical considerations over expediency or short-term gain. Kant's belief that individuals should be treated as ends in themselves, never as mere means to an end, forms the basis for modern human rights and ethical frameworks. This principle underscores the inherent dignity of every person and the moral responsibility we have to respect and protect it. In a world where people are often reduced to statistics, commodities, or tools for achieving political or economic goals, Kant's message is a powerful reminder of our shared humanity and moral obligations. Personal insights and reflections. Reflecting on Kant's philosophy, I am struck by its relevance and challenges in today's complex world. We live in an era where ethical dilemmas often arise in shades of gray, where competing interests and values make it difficult to find clear-cut answers. Kant's insistence on adhering to universal moral laws can seem rigid and even impractical in such contexts. However, it also offers a moral compass that cuts through ambiguity and reminds us that some principles, such as honesty, justice, and respect for human dignity, must remain non-negotiable. In my view, one of the most powerful aspects of Kant's philosophy is its call to moral courage. To act according to duty often requires standing up against powerful forces, challenging societal norms, or making personal sacrifices. Leaders like Nelson Mandela, who sought reconciliation and justice despite immense personal suffering, exemplify the kind of moral integrity that Kant championed. Such examples inspire us to consider our own actions and whether we are willing to act from principle, even when it is difficult. Kant's emphasis on reason also encourages us to think critically about the world around us. In an age of misinformation, polarization, and rapid technological change, the ability to reason independently and ethically is more important than ever. We must question the motives behind policies, the fairness of social systems, and our own biases and assumptions. Kant's philosophy challenges us to move beyond passive acceptance and engage in thoughtful, reasoned dialogue about what it means to live ethically in a diverse and interconnected world. A call to action. As we reflect on Kant's legacy, we must ask ourselves, are we living according to principles that respect the dignity of others? Do we treat people as ends in themselves? Or do we reduce them to mere means for achieving our own goals? Kant's philosophy calls us to examine our motivations and actions, to strive for moral consistency, and to act with integrity even when no one is watching. In practical terms, this means making choices that align with our values and standing up for what is right, even when it is unpopular or inconvenient. It means challenging injustice wherever we see it and advocating for policies and practices that respect human rights and dignity. It means listening to others with empathy and respect, recognizing that each person has intrinsic worth. In the words of Kant himself, two things fill the mind with ever-increasing wonder and awe, the more often and the more intensely the reflection dwells on them. The starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. This quote encapsulates Kant's belief in the profound potential of human reason and morality. It reminds us that, despite our flaws and limitations, we are capable of reaching for something higher, of striving for a more just, compassionate, and rational world. As we navigate the challenges of our time, let us remember that true enlightenment comes not from passive knowledge, but from the active pursuit of moral principles that elevate and unite us as human beings. Kant's philosophy calls us to live thoughtfully, act courageously, and respect the dignity of all, an enduring challenge and a hopeful vision for humanity's moral progress. As we wrap up our deep dive into the life and legacy of Immanuel Kant, what stands out most is the radical challenge he posed to us all: dare to think for yourself, but always with a sense of duty to others. His philosophy, grounded in reason and universal moral laws, pushes us beyond self-interest and fleeting desires. It calls for moral courage in the face of adversity and consistency in the pursuit of justice and dignity for all. Kant's ideas remind us that ethical living isn't easy. It demands careful reflection and an unwavering commitment to principles. Think of leaders like Nelson Mandela or figures like Malala Yousafzai. Their actions, grounded in a sense of duty and moral conviction, exemplify what Kant believed: that real change comes from individuals who act from respect for moral law, not personal gain. But here's the question we must grapple with. In a world that often prizes convenience over integrity, do we have the strength to live according to Kant's principles? Will we treat others as ends in themselves, with dignity and respect, or reduce them to mere means for achieving our goals? The call to moral duty may sound idealistic, even impractical in the real world, but perhaps that's precisely why it's so powerful. Kant challenges us not to settle for what's easy, but to strive for what's right, always guided by reason and respect for others. As you go about your day, I invite you to reflect on Kant's words. Two things fill the mind with ever-increasing wonder and awe, the more often and the more intensely the reflection dwells on them. The starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. Think about your choices, your beliefs, and your actions. Are they aligned with the kind of world you want to see? A world that respects every individual's dignity and autonomy? Thank you for joining us on this philosophical journey at Philosophy Playground. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you found this discussion enlightening. We'd love to hear your thoughts. How do you apply Kant's philosophy in your own life? Drop us a comment below. Until next time, let's keep striving for a world guided by reason, compassion, and unwavering moral principles.